Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you, wherever you are currently in the world. Thank you for joining me on this next lecture, building from our previous conversations in terms of looking at the cultures, civilizations, and peoples of North and South America prior to the arrival of Europeans, and building off of the initial motivations for European. Um, Exploration and eventual colonization. One of the things that I wanted to emphasize to you in the last lecture, which will once again be reified and reestablished in this lecture, are those motivations by Europeans centered around the economic ideology of mercantilism. Remember the idea that there is in the minds of Europeans, and which is to an extent true, given their realm of awareness and where they are habitating in Western Europe at the time, that there is a sense of a finite amount of resources. And in Europe in the 1490s, that was certainly the case, right? Europeans have pretty much maximized all of their land. They have cut down the majority of their forests. Their rivers and lakes are polluted. There is lower fishing stock, and there's a growing population. They've maxed out their yields on their crops. And so there is a sense that there is a limited amount of resources out there, and that in order to acquire these resources for your own personal benefit and to not be subjugated to the power of another, you need to go out and secure these resources. So the initial reasons for Columbus's exploration, for Cortez, for Francisco Pizarro, Hernando de Soto, etc., etc., etc. All of these individuals were motivated by a mercantilistic ideology, right? That there is a search for something. Now, while they may have discovered that there are other incredible empires and achievements out there, that's not exactly what their motivations were. We're looking for tangible resources that can be taken back to Europe. So in this case, gold, silver, whatever goods may be able to come about that may be able to turn a profit, right? The intention is not to stay. The intention is not to, build outposts and establish colonies as of yet. Remember, this is the 1490s, early 1500s. However, what we're going to see in this lecture is that things begin to change, right? It is not that the ideas of mercantilism have changed, but the manner in which the extraction of wealth from these outposts, which would eventually develop into colonies, begin to be established, right? As it becomes clear to explorers, whether they are Spanish, Portuguese, English, French, that there are resources that are quite abundant, but in both North and South America, but getting at them is not necessarily as easy as they thought, right? It's not that there's just gold laying around or that there's cities of diamonds or that anything can just be easily plucked, put on a ship, and then sent back to Europe. Rather, it has to be labored and cultivated in order to be able to turn those things into something that is consumable and something that can be used and eventually refined in Europe. So, what we're going to be looking at here is we're going to be looking at those motivations, what exactly leads to the establishment of various outposts in the New World, what exactly, who were those groups, what exactly were they interested in doing, why exactly there were some differences, right, in terms of the motivations, like the motivations between the Spanish and Portuguese as opposed to the French and the English. This is also going to be reflected in the types of colonies and outposts that they establish in North and South America, and it will also affect the labor systems that eventually take hold and develop. Okay, so we're going to be taking a look at all of that. So let's go ahead and let's get into it. So when we were discussing, and I'm just trying to find a place to situate my camera down there so that you guys aren't, looking at things that are blocked. So when we take a look at the Spanish and the Portuguese, right? These are the initial world powers, European powers, that are interested in establishing themselves in the newly discovered, in the minds of Europeans, newly discovered lands that are located in North and South America. The Spanish established themselves in various areas, Florida, Central America, present-day Mexico, and in South America, the Portuguese also in present-day Brazil. But there are also others, right? There's once word gets out that there is this land that has been discovered, the English get involved, the French get involved, the Dutch get involved, right? Various other European players start to be able to take and make a presence in North and South America. Now, it's important to understand, how exactly these outposts are established, where exactly and how exactly they're maintained in terms of this control. Essentially, it works like this no matter what the power is, okay? Somebody of elite status, maybe the king or the queen, both, or some sort of noble individual who is attached to that elite power back in Europe decrees or supports and gives a command or an opportunity for another individual, whether it is a couple of investors, maybe some ship owners, maybe it's some explorers, to go out there and to charter a series of vessels to go out and explore and establish some sort of outpost, right? Some sort of foothold that can be claimed to be able to maintain some sort of sphere of influence and control. These initially start out as basically military outposts, right? They eventually are going to grow into what we will consider to be colonies. But both the Spanish, the Portuguese, and eventually the English, the French, and the Dutch are going to establish what we would consider basically forts. Forts throughout. Like one of the oldest forts to be established and what is, basically a new world settlement from the perspective of the Europeans that exists in North America is St. Augustine, Florida, right? This was one of the earliest outposts established by the Spanish in the 16th century. You can still see it to this day. It's a city, but they actually have still some of the remnants of the old fort. And this was basically to establish a military presence of control so that ships that are coming in and out of that area, whether they are going to parts of the Caribbean and are coming up the Florida coast, that there is a military outpost and stronghold there so that other foreign explorers won't try to take over or bother their ships or be able to, control that area of trade. So what is important to understand is that in 1490, the Spanish start to establish themselves, the Portuguese, but then other groups start to establish themselves. And so what you see is that, like in a place like New Orleans, for instance, if you ever go to New Orleans, what you'll notice is that it is a blend of many different cultures. French, Spanish, English, clearly the presence of imported African slaves, right? You have all of these different cultures that are basically emulsifying themselves within one space. And that is because of the history of the area. It was often controlled by various powers at different points in time. As we move from in the early 1500s to the mid 1500s and eventually into the 1600s, what we do is we see a shift. And this shift really largely has to do with what's going on in Europe. So in the late 1490s, early 1500s, we really see Spanish and Portuguese dominance, and that still continues to very much of this, to this period in the 1600s as well. But what we also see is we see the emergence of a greater presence of French, British, and Dutch, especially in North America. And the reason why this is because of what is going on in Europe at the time. So there are a lot of conflicts that are still happening in Europe, the 30 Years' War, various skirmishes between Spain and England, like the Spanish Armada that's eventually gets, knocked over by Queen Elizabeth I. There's some other reformations and aspects in terms of religiosity, new structures, new ways of thinking, all sorts of things that are going on in Europe that doesn't necessarily allow direct control and influence of what's going on in these newly established ports of call, these new areas of military outposts and eventual colonies. And that's important for us to know because as we progress, as societies become more and more established in this region, in both North and South America, these are without that direct intervention and that direct, control, that is what is going to lead to the development of an independent identity, something that is separate from those individuals who would call themselves Spanish or English or Dutch or French. Certainly derived, delineated, share certain aspects of language, aspects of culture, right? Thought processes, but because of their experiences without the direct intervention and control of the quote unquote mother country, these little outposts and eventual colonies begin to develop their own sense of who they are. And we will see this in particular with the British colonies, later the United States, but also with when you eventually see the independence movements that take place throughout Central and South America in the 19th century, right? When they are trying to rid themselves of Spain, because you clearly can see that much like in the under the British colonial system of rule, the Spanish colonial system of rule also saw these, issues with, a king, a government that is several thousand miles away, trying to impose their rules, their laws, their expectations, and there didn't seem to be that sort of equal footing. But for the purposes of going forward, because we're not going to be speaking a lot about the Spanish or the Portuguese because of the areas that we are going to be talking about for North America in particular. But it is important to first understand, as I mentioned with the labor systems that the Spanish established, like with the encomienda system and the caste system, that these are systems of labor that become familiar to the eventual establishments and outposts that will be put in place by the French, by the British, and by the Dutch. Now, for the United States, as the Spanish and the Portuguese have their hands full and busy with what's going on in their regions, the areas of North America become open and essentially open for exploration, right? There's little patrolling that's going on by Spanish ships in that area, even though the Treaty of Tordesillas, gave Spain control over these regions. There really isn't much Spanish incursion along the east coast of what would be called the United States. Now, that's not to say that they're not there, right? They are. But in terms of being able to keep a foothold and a maintenance in terms of control, that is just not the case, which leaves the opening for other areas. So if we take a look at some of the early establishments that are happening in terms of the exploration that happens in the mid 1500s, and then eventually the establishment of actual colonies in the 1600s, you can see like there with France, you have the establishment of cities like Montreal and Quebec. You have the English settlements. Perhaps you've heard of the Roanoke colony, Jamestown we will be talking about. But of course, Plymouth Colony, 1620, and Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. And the Dutch, of course, on Fort Nassau, which is present-day Albany, but then also, the settlement of the Dutch in present-day Manhattan Island, etc. So, but to be clear, that these are areas that are meant to establish a foothold, a military presence, for the ability to be able to extract whatever wealth is necessary that can be derived from that colony. Okay. Now, depending on where you are and depending on, what country, in the region that you're in, it's going to depend on what exactly you're going to be extracting. So if you take a look at this map, and let me move myself up here. There we go. We take a look at this map here on the left. What you can see is the general regions of control by various European powers. What you can see there in the blue is largely the French sphere of influence. What you can see with the British under Great Britain, that sort of pink reddish color. And then and then the orange area down there, that is the area that is controlled by Spain. So that's like Spanish Florida area down here, not too far from in this region, because this is what Mexico, Texas. Oh, why are we going so far back? And areas like that. Now, one thing that I do want you to note is I want you to notice the difference. The difference here in terms of what is being established by whom. Now, if you notice the French, notice everything here. Fort Bohemond, Fort Detroit, Fort St. Pierre, Montreal, Quebec, right? Fort St. Louis, right? Fort Orleans. A lot of forts, right? There wasn't an establishment to be able to necessarily create a cities like they do with Montreal and Quebec. Most of the intent by the French were to actually create military outposts for the establishment to control the fur trade that's in this area. Okay. Furs are very valuable. They get you a lot of money in Europe. And so there is a strong market for it. So the French wanted to be able to control this region. In comparison with the British, what you see is the establishment of actual colonies for the purpose of trying to extrapolate wealth locally and establish themselves in terms of creating thriving outposts. So what we're seeing here is that whereas the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese were interested in trying to reap whatever could be taken from the land, whether it's furs, whether it's gold, whether it's, lumber, whether it is silver, right? The British have a very different approach in terms of creating these colonies, largely establishing themselves as small farmers. Eventually, these will become larger plantations, as we will see in the case of Jamestown. But essentially, these are outposts that are meant to create, military. They're supported with military, but there is an intention to not just create a military control, but to establish an actual city that is actually being able to build, to grow, to extrapolate the wealth, develop goods and services, produce those, send them back to Europe to be refined, and then to be sent back to the colonies. Okay. So there's still an extraction of wealth. It's just the way in which they go about it. One is simply grab the wealth as you see it there, dig it out of the ground, catch it and trap it, bring it back to Europe. Or are we going to actually settle, grow something, stay in one place, build a crop, and then ship it? Okay. So these are the two different ways of thinking, right? One is going to lead towards establishments of basically military outposts, a couple people, a place where people can check in, a little bit of safety. And then another is going to establish an actual cities, right? That are going to create these outposts that are, yes, underneath the control of the king or the country of origin, but there's going to be far more willingness in which to build something and to stay, right? The intention with many of the beginning approaches of the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the French was just to get something, get what you need, stay a while, and then return. The British aspect is different, is that the intention wasn't to return as quickly. Did some people go back? Of course they did. But there's more of an intention to stay, to establish oneself here with some of these new opportunities. All right. So if we look at some of the exploration that the Dutch did, right, under, their West India Company, you have people like Henry Hudson, who was an English captain, but he actually worked for the East India Company. And, he helps establish, and explores, present day areas like New York Harbor, Manhattan Island, he, like many other people, because none of this really changed, from the period of Christopher Columbus, they were still looking for a passageway to get to Asia, right? So he's looking for every little river, every little port, every little aspect, because there's got to be a way that we can get to Asia, because still very much the riches, still very much the trade. But like he and so many others, they never found it because, and they wouldn't find it until late in the 19th century when people were actually able to go through the Arctic cross and go in that direction. Okay, so it's interesting just to recognize the establishments and whom exactly was a part. So the Dutch exploration, in terms of their charters and in terms of their intentions, while essentially to try to find a passage to get to Asia, they actually do begin to establish these outposts in present day New York. When we look at the early attempts by colonization, we really see some major problems. Okay. Now, I want you to try to think for a second, you know, because we have this sort of romanticized narrative that's often portrayed, whether it's in popular culture or film or, something on YouTube or even TikTok or something like that, to where there is like something sexy about establishing an outpost, maybe some sort of adventurousness, this idea of starting, and beginning in a new world. Nothing could be further from the truth, people. Okay. You have to understand that the approaches that had made Europeans successful in Europe did not necessarily translate themselves to success here in North America. The main reason is because we have very different climates. We have new expectations. There are new challenges, new problems that they have to try to solve. And one of the earliest examples of this failure is what happens with Sir Walter Raleigh under Elizabeth I when she says that he can help establish a colony, and this is in the late 1580s. Where it's off the coast of North Carolina. There's a 100 people or so, and they established themselves, but there was extreme struggle. They're struggling against the water, the quality of life, the weather, how to grow crops, all of these things. And what I'll get into, the problems that Roanoke had are very similar to the same problems that Jamestown had. And what's interesting about the Roanoke legend, if you're, from North Carolina, most young kids learn about this, is that the colony just completely disappears. Right? No one's entirely sure what happened to these individuals. It's not entirely sure if they were completely massacred or if they just, ran off. Some theories are that they just joined the local Croatan people, Native Americans. Maybe went to simply live out, and survive in another fashion. People aren't too sure. But what was clear from this and from many of the early establishments is that it was extremely difficult to establish oneself as a colony. And no better exactly is that an example in terms of what exactly is going to happen with some of the larger establishments that take place in Virginia. Because these early exploration, like I said, is centered on trying to get the resources out, trying to find a water route to Asia, trying to hurry up and find whatever we can to benefit ourselves financially. Remember that mercantile attitude. Let's just get something, get it, take it back, use it, get ourselves rich, and then we're good. We're out. We don't need to deal with this, right? Because going to the colonies wasn't sexy. I mean, it was literally a death sentence for many people because it wasn't just the journey getting there, which was precarious in itself. It's not the fact that your ship could sink or that you might be captured by pirates or some other aspect, but you might have disease. You might even have plague when you get onto the ship. Then you get dumped off and literally you have to figure out how to survive. It's not like there's like a thriving, city when you arrive. People are barely making it by. And so when we think of like an outpost, we're really talking about like two buildings surrounded by a little bit of a wooden, wall and maybe a couple people with some guns. Like we're not talking about a thriving, thriving space, right? Hunger is rampant. Disease is rampant. Physical threats are rampant. You've got the Native American, incursion, as well as the threats from other European powers that are just sailing by. Like, this is not exactly, a world of safety and hope. Like this is like tragedy and death. And so when we think about all these aspects, we really want to be able to come to a head when we think of like Jamestown. Now, I think it's important, without going into like so much detail. But, when we think of Jamestown and its location in Virginia, right, there's often this sense of like, oh, it was noble, it was these hardworking colonists that really were trying to make something of themselves. Well, we have to call it out for what it is. So let's first be clear. One of the biggest challenges with establishing a colony and establishing a system of organization is that when you are establishing a brand new space, remember there's nothing there. Okay, there's nothing there. They don't have shelter, they don't have protection, they don't have crops, they don't have anything. Okay, and literally you're getting off a boat after basically you were starving to death, nearly get yourself killed, and now guess what? You've got to survive. Okay, problem is that when people get off of these ships, they have the people who are chartering the ship, people who have been put in charge either by some sort of elite individual or maybe even the king, right? And they're chartered to create this colony. Well, because there are these different tiers on the boat, right? You have like gentry, maybe you have nobility, maybe you have people who are, indentured servants, maybe you have people who are coming for a new life, whatever the case may be. The fact of the matter is that the only way that this is going to work is if everybody works together and does their part. Well, I'm sure I don't have to, remind you of anything, but that, usually when you come from privilege in an area like England, you're probably not too used to actually digging your own ditches or actually laying the foundation for a city, right? But in a period such as this, everybody has to do their part. This was one of the contributing factors to the failure of Jamestown, was the actual leadership itself. Turns out the people who were in charge of the colony didn't want to do much work. They certainly were good at telling everybody else what to do, but they didn't want to do it themselves. That's the first problem. Everybody has to work. Everybody has to contribute. Everybody has to do something. You can't just dictate to people. You have to do it yourself. Why? Because every able-bodied person. You can't just tell people what to do and then benefit from the shelter that they built or the protection that they built or the food that they cultivated simply because of your title. This was one of the first areas of conflict that really affected Jamestown because many people were resentful of the leadership. Now, the leadership was also responsible for, the choosing of the location. Boy, they couldn't have chose a worse location for a colony. They chose a low-lying salt marsh, okay? Why? Because they thought it was close enough to the ocean, so where they could be able to, glean shellfish and regular fish and be able to have aspects in terms of that. Well, here's the problem with the salt marsh, is that the water doesn't flow in and out unless the tide actually carries it out. So you have stagnant water. When you have stagnant water, you add that to the fact that people are usually defecating and relieving themselves in the exact same water that they're trying to drink. There's the second problem, okay? So if you have a location of water where the water isn't flowing and your excrement isn't being pushed out into the sea, it just sits, you've got a ripe situation for disease. And that is precisely what happened, right? The failure of the drinking water led to disease. The ability for the water to be too salty and, inhospitable to raising crops led to crop failure. So the food sustenance, the ability in which to survive was already put into huge jeopardy. And so the issue in terms of starvation, right, due to the fact that there was poor leadership, due to the fact that there was, ineffective agreement to work together, due to the fact that there was poor resources, location, all of this leads to a completely precarious situation and a colony. Now, if you've ever visited Jamestown, you can see this whole archaeological site and they have a great museum and everything else. And it's pretty cool. Take a look, take a look. But if I can complicate it for you, the process of colonization, especially at Jamestown, was anything but tranquil, romantic, or serene. Okay. If anything, it was unpredictable. it was disease ridden, and it was extremely precarious. Okay. And we can actually see this. There's a video that I will put up, but I will pull it up for you right here. It's called Secrets of the Dead, and it talks about in particular this one winter that actually happens in Jamestown's history, where as a result of Native American incursion, the inability to go out, the failure of the crops, basically societal norms, standards, and behaviors completely break down. The colony starts to starve to death, and as a result, we have a issue in terms of how the inhabitants inside the fort decide to survive. So let me play it for you.
The scientists suspect this bone is somehow connected to the jawbone they found. The most crucial find in structure 191 is a cranium, which probably also belongs to the same set of remains.
Once the cranium was excavated, there's some marks on there that are real unusual. And we were able to see some of that during the excavation. You could see that there were some marks, but until the soil was removed, it wasn't really clear that these were such big hack marks, basically.
The 4 cut marks on one side are clear, without any doubts. And on the back, something has chopped right through the skull.
Why would you have marks on the front and back?
James' skull obviously showed cut marks on the forehead and a heavier blow to the back of the skull. I really wanted to look at it more closely to see if perhaps this was a sign of violent death or murder.
We saw more and more marks that were pointing to a possibility even more bizarre than murder. Frankly, I was speechless. We look at this and we're thinking, wow, this could be evidence of cannibalism.
Yeah. Cannibalism, people. One of the reasons, and you can take a look at the link itself and watch it if you'd like. But one of the things that what they discover at Jamestown is that this young woman who had come over as an indentured servant, while her body gave indicators of cannibalism, meaning that there was a blow mark to the head, but there were these cut marks along the jaw, cut marks along the head, meaning that it looks like somebody was trying to like scalp off or cut off pieces of meat that could be consumed. One of the reasons why they suspect cannibalism is because of where the body was found. What's interesting about it, if you watch the video, is that this body of this young girl who they called Jane, Jane's body was found basically in what we would call the trash bin, okay, which is quite unusual, right? Usually if somebody dies, they're usually buried, right? They're buried in some sort of ceremonial space, they're buried with other people, right? They're not found in a trash pile where there's just this body, as well as other evidence of wasted food. There was also a dead horse carcass, etc. And this was also found in an area of a house that would be considered a kitchen. So when you put all that together and you take into account the tragedy of what is happening in Jamestown in terms of the lack of organization, the lack of willingness to actually do the work, the failure of the crops, the disease, you have a perfect storm in terms of the chaos, and one of the reasons why cannibalism was present in Jamestown. Okay? So, what's interesting about it is that, when you're looking at these colonies and, if you are an investor or if you're the king or if you're somebody who's like backing these things, you're trying to figure out like, how can we get a hold on this? Like, how can we make sure that these colonies survive? How can we put things into place? And essentially what happens is that the leadership of various, investing houses, whether it's like the London Company or the Dutch East Indian Company, right? Whatever these investors are, is they basically figure out, look, we need to get better leadership. We need to have people who actually know what they're doing, who have an intention. They are know how to establish themselves. They know how to be organized. They know how to run a colony so that we can eventually, remember, get our return from, the investment that we're getting, right? We're not collecting furs. We're not doing anything else. We're trying to establish a colony so that we can be able to reap some sort of benefits from the land and be able to use whatever those benefits are to send them back to England to make a profit. Okay. So sounds good. Well, it's like, but the problem is that these companies really were trying to figure out how exactly they were going to do it. Now, if any of you have watched any Disney movies, which I never suggest that this is where you get your history from, because in the movie, Pocahontas, right, who was a real person, okay, real person, right? No, she did not fall in love with John Smith. She actually fell in love with the other John. His name is John Rolfe, okay? And so, don't use Disney as a way for your historical narrative in X, Y, and Z. But John Rolfe is one of these individuals who has been given a charter by the London Company to be able to establish and figure out this colony in Virginia. Now, John Smith was also a real person. He also was an individual in the Jamestown colony, and there is strong evidence to show that he actually was highly organized and that he did get things done. However, he was not well liked. He was not somebody that people particularly enjoyed being around, and it mainly had to do with the fact that many of those people who were above him in terms of social status really didn't like being told what to do, right? It goes back to that organizational aspect. But here we have somebody by the name of John Rolfe, who actually part of the elite, but he's extremely capable and he knows how to get things done. And the one thing that he knows that he needs to do if he is going to be successful in this area of Jamestown is that he has got to figure out how we are going to create some sort of peace agreement with the Powhatans, right? The Powhatans, which is the Native American group that's basically outside of the gates of the Jamestown colony, right? They're the ones that are attacking. They're the ones that are, constantly, making us fearful for our lives, right? We've got all these problems, so we've got to figure out a way to do this, okay? Well, John Rolfe, who realizes that, okay, if this colony is going to do well, we need more land, we need better land in which to farm, right? We need to be able to make some agreements. So he decides to make some agreements with the local Powhatan tribe. And one of the best agreements to be able to show your interest in creating a mutually beneficial deal and to actually, create an alliance is to marry somebody. And that's precisely what he does, is he gets with Pocahontas, right? Now, what's interesting about this, okay, is that this is completely scandalous, right? Marrying a Native American? What are you, nuts? We're going to marry a savage? What are you, insane? We can't do that. Well, John Rolfe is a practical man, right? Now, you've heard this idea that, yes, the Europeans were like, well, we need to civilize these people and bring them to God. And we need to be able to have these opportunities in which they can, not burn in hell. So they have to know the word and embrace Christ and X, Y, and Z. Cool. Okay. But remember how I said in the beginning that facts are stubborn things? It's interesting when it comes out of one's mouth, their actual motivations. Okay. And here's an example. Why exactly can I not get out of this? Can I press escape? There we go. There we go. Okay. Let me go back here. Let me go back one. Okay. So we have a letter here. And this is actually it's on Canvas. Okay. So you can take a look at it. I put it there as one of the primary sources. And it's nice because it has the actual letter here, and then they actually typed it out so that you could see it as well. Okay. What I wanted to show you was this. Okay. It's kind of important because there's this argument that he makes in this letter at the beginning. Hey, you want to know the reason why I'm marrying this girl? It's because she's a savage and we need to bring her to Christ. And that's the reason why. It's so important that I do the right thing. We need to make her a servant of God. And the only way that we can civilize her is if she actually takes on a husband and takes on these traditions and eventually establishes herself in this way. Now, that's pretty interesting considering who he's writing this letter to, his friend, Sir Thomas Dale. But Sir Thomas Dale is also one of the investors, right, in the company. So he's also trying to explain himself like, look, I know you're kind of worried about the whole investment thing, but let me tell you why I'm doing it. And it's really quite interesting. Read right here. I'm going to read it out loud. So if you take a look at this, this paragraph right here, okay? Let therefore this my well-advised protestation, which here I make between God and my own conscience, be a sufficient witness, and all the dreadful day of judgment, when the secret of all men's hearts shall be opened to condemn me herein, if my chiefest intent and purpose be not to strive with all my power of body and mind in the undertaking of so mighty a matter, he's talking about the marriage, no way led so far forth as man's weakness may permit, right? So he's not doing it for lust, right? He's not doing that with the unbridled desire of carnal affection, right? Not doing that, not doing it because she looks good and I want to get with her, but for the good of this plantation, for the honor of our country, and for the glory of God, for my own salvation, and for the converting to the true knowledge of God and Jesus Christ, an unbelieving creature named Pocahontas. Ah, you don't really love her. You don't really care about that. You're doing this for the business. Oh, how expedient. Of course I'm getting with her. Yeah, I'm saying that I'm doing it for God and everything else, but I'm really doing it for the plantation. You want to know why? We need the land. And how the heck are we supposed to farm the land if they're constantly fighting and burning everything down? If I'm married to her, they're not going to fight. What do you think? What do you think, Sir Dale? Sound like a plan? He admits it right here, people. He admits it right here. This is precisely the issue. Precisely the issue. And it's fascinating because one of the things about this, about, John Rolfe, is that he establishes this approach to creating alliances in the new world that others will begin to imitate, right? Yeah, I'm saying that, we're doing it for God and, everything else, but, we're really just trying to do it for the land because we need to get this, because here's one thing to be very clear. Since Roanoke, the Native Americans, as soon as anybody was arriving, the Native Americans were not having it. Put that whole, Mayflower, Thanksgiving thing aside. Okay. That is the, mystical historical narrative that's meant to, whitewash the reality of the motivations here. Okay. And I'll get into the Pilgrims and, their aspect of what they were about when we start talking about the Salem witch trials. Okay. But for the purposes here, they need land. They need land because they have a crop that they want to start growing. Anybody want to guess what it is? Tobacco. Okay. Let's take a look. So he's got his deal. He's made his peace. We're doing it for the plantation. Okay. Now, we got our land. We got a crop. We need some people. Okay. We need people here. All right. So labor in the colonies, right? what I want you to recognize here is that we are going to see the evolution of labor systems in the North American colonies. We're going to start with Native Americans. We're going to move to indentured servants. Okay. Why start with Native Americans? Well, number one, they're here. Okay. They're already here. Let's just use the labor that we got. Well, we run into a couple of problems. Here's the first one. We sneeze. They have no ability to be able to withstand the diseases that we Europeans have been able to, learn how to resist. They don't have any resistance to them, so they die. Okay, well, that sucks. So once I trained my worker and finally get them to do what I want to do, they die. Second thing is that if they don't want to work, they just run back into the forest. I don't know where they went. They just disappeared, right? Because we don't go out there. We don't know what's out there. We're probably going to can't go and get them back, right? So there's the problem. So then the second thing that they try is they try indentured servants. Now, what is an indentured servant? Now, you can see an example of an indenture right here. An indenture is essentially an agreement that I, the person who will be giving up my labor for a period of time in exchange for shelter, maybe some food, the opportunity to work, to pay off my debt. And then once my debt is paid off, I will have the opportunity in which to get paid for my labor, get some land, and move on. Okay? Sounds like a good deal. Remember, they're running out of resources in Europe. Indentured servitude sounds like a good plan. Okay? Well, there's interesting to see if you actually take a look at this link, and this is actually on there. You might want to just take a look at some of the conditions that indentured servants were facing, right? My most humble duty remember to you, hoping in God of your good health, as myself am at the making hereof. This is to let you understand that I, your child, am in a most heavy case by reason of the nature of the country, which is such that it causeth much sickness, as the scurvy and the bloody flux and divers other diseases, which maketh the body very poor and weak. And when we are sick, there is nothing to comfort us. For since I came out of the ship, I never ate anything but peas and lobalolly, that is water gruel. As for deer or venison, I never saw any since I came to this land. There is indeed some fowl, but we are not allowed to go and get it, but must work hard, both early and late, for a mess of water gruel and a mouthful of bread and beef. A mouthful of bread for a penny loaf must serve for 4 men, which is most pitiful. People cry out day and night, "Oh, that we were in England without their limbs, and would not care to lose any limb to be in England again. Yet, yea, though they beg from door to door. For we live in fear of the enemy every hour. Yet we have had combat with them on the Sunday before Shrovetide, and we took 2 alive and made slaves of them. But it was by policy, for we are in great danger, for our plantation is very weak, by reason of death and sickness in our company. For we came but 20 for the merchant, and they are half dead, and we look every hour when 2 more should go. Yet there came some 4 men yet to live with us, of which there is but 1 alive, and our lieutenant is dead, and his father and his brother." Okay? Doesn't sound like a very good system, right? Doesn't sound like it's very appetizing. You work from morning to night, you get fed very poorly, you're hungry all the time, there's constant threats from Native Americans, people are dying all around you. Doesn't sound like it's a very good system. Plus, if you are a person who's relying on this labor, the labor is going to be okay, but it's not fixed. It's only for a short period of time. And so, what was always an issue during this period of indentured servitude was always looking for a fixed labor source. We tried Native Americans, they run away into the forest or they die. Indentured servants are only here for a short time, not a long time. So, I can't necessarily be able to depend on them when I'm trying to develop the cash crops of tobacco, indigo, or rice for cultivation and trade. Okay? So, the question becomes, where exactly are we going to get the next form of labor? Now, there's a very interesting story And if you are interested, like me, being the nerd that I am, okay, if you ever read like the General Council minutes of the Virginia colonies from the 17th century, because it's oh so lovely reading, you will find that the colonies at this time, right, in the 17th century, are still very much figuring things out. Okay. They're figuring things out because the process of labor, the process of establishing one's colonies, remember, they have charters from the king or from various merchant companies, but they don't, but they have to figure these things out on their own, right? They have to defend themselves. They have to figure out how to organize themselves. They have to figure out punishments and X, Y, and Z, right? So these are the things that are trying to figure out. Now, what I want to show you in this story here, it is the story, and maybe some of you know it. It's called the John Punch case. Okay. John Punch, as the image, this is him right here. Okay. John Punch is an indentured servant. He's black. Okay. And in his case, and this takes place in 1640, okay, in Virginia. And John Punch, along with two other individuals, um, by the name of Hugh Gwynn and I think it's James Gregory, if I'm correct. Okay. It's Hugh Gwynn, James Gregory, and John Punch. There's three indentured servants. Hugh Gwynn and James Gregory, one is a Scotchman and one is a Dutchman. And then you have John Punch, who is black, who's a Negro. Okay. As the terminology was of the time. Now they're all indentured servants. They all have agreed to, give their labor up for a period of time. They're under these conditions, whatever the case may be. But as we read in that letter, conditions kind of suck. And so the three of them basically come up with a plan that, you know what, they're going to run away. And they run away to Maryland, all three of them. But they get caught. Okay? So they get caught and they get brought back to Virginia. And they're brought back to Virginia and they're brought into court because their master, the person who holds their indentures, is really pissed off, right? He's like, well, wait a second, you're costing me time and money and labor. Like I've lost out on all this while you've been running away off to Maryland. Okay. So he's brought back. And what's very interesting is that you can actually read about it here, right here on the general court proceedings. And what I will do is that I will take a look at the area right here that is most important. Let me move myself over here to the side. Okay. So this is the reading from the judge in terms of the punishment that is going to come down on Hugh Gwynn and on James Gregory and on John Punch. Okay. So let's read it. Whereas Hugh Gwynn hath by order from this board brought back from Maryland 3 servants formerly run away from the said Gwynn, the court doth therefore order that the 3 servants shall receive the punishment of whipping, and to have 30 stripes apiece, one called Victor, a Dutchman, a Scotchman called James Gregory, and the first shall serve out their times with their master according to their indentures, and 1 whole year apiece after the time of their service is expired. Okay. So they have to do whatever their rest of their indenture is, and they got a whole nother year. By their said indentures, in recompense of his loss, sustained by their absence and after their service to their said master is expired, to serve the colony for 3 whole years apiece. Okay. So they got their indenture, a year, and another 3 years to the colony. So 4 years total. Okay. And that third being a Negro named John Punch shall serve his said master for his assigns for the time of his natural life herein or elsewhere. Wait, why didn't he get the 4 years? Why does he get life? Now, what's very interesting about this is that the judge in this decision doesn't mention the word slavery. But that's exactly what the judge just created. And it's 1640. Okay. Now, the reason why I want you guys to recognize that is because it's very important for us to understand that the presence of slaves in North America wasn't unknown, right? But it's not an established fact that everybody who is an imported African is a slave. We have, John Rolfe describing 20 or so, in his term, Negroes arriving in 1619 to the colony. We have the presence of Black slaves in other parts of areas like Massachusetts, Virginia, Maryland, right? We have the presence here, but it's not an established fact that slavery is an institution that is inextricably linked to those people who are like John Punch, right? We do have indentured servants that are serving in these capacities. So the question is like, well, how does it become that way, right? And it becomes that way because this judge in this decision opens the door for it by setting a precedent that a life servitude for this individual, which everybody can see, well, the only difference between him is the fact that he is a Black man. And so now this is where you begin to sow that seed of being able to associate a conditionality of servitude for life with an actual person, right? And so this is where it begins. Now, it takes time for this to establish. This isn't like, oh, immediately, hey, we've got it right here. But what's very interesting about this is that if you look at the movements that are made immediately following that legal precedent in 1640, in 1641, we have Massachusetts legalizing slavery. 20 years later, we have the General Assembly in Massachusetts claiming that Negro women who have children will serve in a condition according to whatever the status of the mother is. So now a child can be born a slave. 1667, right? Baptism of slaves cannot save them from becoming slaves, right? Doesn't matter because the prior time was that if they're a Christian, they can't be a slave. That is no longer the case. Now you have to ask yourselves, why exactly does this happen in 1640? What is actually taking place? Well, what's taking place throughout Massachusetts all the way down the eastern seaboard is that there is a greater development in terms of farming production. What people had discovered is that we have various crops, various means of production that need a labor force that can be physically tied to the land. It is predetermined, it's fixed, and it's dependable. This is how slavery gets established in the New World. Okay? And what's very fascinating about this is that, remember, it's really appearing in various places, Massachusetts, Virginia, Maryland, right, South Carolina. What you're seeing is that the ways in which these colonies are establishing the principle of slavery parallels the actual practice of it, the treatment of it, the expectations, the performativity of it, right? It doesn't just happen overnight. It takes time. It takes literally, we're talking over a century to become an established aspect within the colonies in terms of labor that becomes dependent. But what it coincides with, it actually coincides with the system of slavery in terms of its importation. What I would like you guys to look at, before I go back to this area, is I want to show you another link. And I'm not sure if any of you have seen this, but this is another platform that you can use. And I put this on our canvas as well. You can see this here in terms of this platform documents slave ships that come from the west coast of Africa. So we're talking about all the way from Senegal down to present-day Namibia. And what you see is that these little dots represent a ship. Now, the larger the dot, the more people that are actually on it. And if you click on it, it'll actually tell you where the ship started and where it ended. So you take this ship here. It's from the Netherlands, so it puts the flag up there, and it says the ship left Rio Forcados, Formosa, Benin in 1660 with 478 people and arrived in Curacao with 411. How do we know these things? Well, we know these things because each of these ships are essentially a commercial vehicle. And the commercial vehicle it has to keep an established record of who's on board, the cargo, essentially. Notice that about 67 people, if I got that right. Yes, 67 people died along the journey here. Okay. Now, what I want to do is I'm going to play it just so that you can see how this changes. Notice the timeline down here, 1520, 1540, 1560. But look at where we are with 1640, 1660, 1680. This is the period when slavery becomes where we actually have the John Punch case. We start to have the establishment of it, but I want you to see where slaves really start to take off in this area. Okay. So we'll start right here. And you can see the year up here changing, and you'll just see the ships. And I'm just going to speed it up just a little bit. There you go. There we go. And what you'll notice here is that you'll only see maybe a couple of ships go up, like the Blessing right here, Great Britain, from Senegal to what port where did they stop? They stopped in Maryland. Okay. 179 enslaved, they arrived with 158. Okay. What you'll notice is like the difference between the ones that are coming from that are being run by the Netherlands, that are being run by Great Britain. What you'll notice is that like where exactly they're establishing themselves. It's very important to understand the first stop essentially was going to be Brazil, second stop was going to be the Caribbean, Mexico, third stop was going to be the United States. The United States had the lowest population of enslaved people, mainly because of that the demand for slaves shifts. The demand for slaves essentially increases post 1800s, right? In terms of that. But what you'll see is that this area of how it develops. But what I want you to notice from this is like how exactly what ships, what countries are controlling the trade. Like notice the color changes. It'll go from like Dutch to Great Britain to, the French. You'll also see the Portuguese. Like you'll see this and notice where they're going, right? I mean, literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of ships. And what you can see is that it really starts to take off more as we get into the 18th century, heading up here into Maryland, heading into here to South Carolina, heading into New Orleans, right? But there's also one of the things that is only moderately documented are the ships that stop in the Caribbean and then go to this area, okay? What's interesting is that because we don't have a lot of documentation in terms of like how many have gone to actual parts of Mexico, as you can see, look at everybody's going to the parts of the Caribbean. Everybody's like right there. That's that. Wait, let me go back. Let me go back on that one. Go back. Oops. Pause. Okay. Notice all of the ones that are going here to South Carolina, right? Charleston. Right? Everybody's going in this area because what we're seeing with this cash crop is that there's a major cash crop that's growing. Okay. So what you can see here is that take a look at this, but I want you to think about how this coincides with the formalization of slavery. As labor increases in terms of its demand, right? The people who own these plantations, the people who govern these colonies, who are usually one and the same, they need to make sure that the labor is fixed, that it's dependable, and that it's always going to be able to be resupplied. And the way that you do that is by creating systems which legalize slavery. Fascinating stuff is that if you take a look at Virginia, like these various acts that are passed in 1672, 1680, right? You have various laws that prevent against insurrection, various laws that punish runaways, various laws that allow you what you can do and not do with your slaves. When you think about, these acts, right, you can clearly see that these are individuals who are very understanding of why it is so important to be able to delineate between one group and another, right? If you take the law in 1691, right, that anybody that, they voted to banish any white man who married outside of the race. If they married their slave, a mulatto, an Indian, right? Any white woman who gives birth to a mulatto child, pay a heavy fine or be sold into servitude, right? I mean, these are periods in which we are really trying to figure things out, right? This is a country that is trying to figure itself out in terms of what works in terms of creating an economic system where a certain group can dominate over a labor system that is going to be basically tied to the land. All right. And so, really, when you look at these different acts of what's developing, is that we are moving away from a system of indentured servitude and servants to one of slaves, right? We are creating essentially with these laws a racial caste system, right? That is legally binding. It is denoted upon that idea of race, right? Raza, the Spanish term, right? It is enshrined in a sense of property rights, of ownership of these people, right? Ownership of who they are, the ownership of the children that they have, right? It creates restrictions in terms of what these people can and cannot do, the roles that they can play in society, what they are legally able to do. It also governs the interracial frameworks between various groups, right? Who can marry whom? What are the legitimate children? What exactly are the controls that we can put in place, right? And it creates these legal frameworks, and it over time, when we parallel the actual enactment, the cultures that develop around it, the behaviors, the expectations, and most importantly, the sentiments, how they parallel and develop themselves from the laws, right? It is the laws that give rise to these sentiments and cultural understandings, right? By putting in a law that says that a woman who has a child, and whatever the position of that woman is, shall so too be the child's. That is creating a outcome that is specifically tied to a condition. That condition creates a sentiment among those people who are in that condition and those who are not. It creates an othering. And that othering is what is going to lead to those defining aspects in terms of what we associate with what people can and cannot do, that is associated with their race, their class, and their gender. Okay? So as a result, what we see is slavery spreading. It spreads throughout the colonies, right? If you take a look at this map, you can see that many of the slaves that are coming up from the British West Indies, right, and where they're stopping. But I think what you might be very surprised about is that the assumption is that, oh, there's only slavery, in the South, right? It's only in the areas of Virginia on down. But that's just not the case, right? There is a massive importation of slaves in New York, in Pennsylvania. I mean, Benjamin Franklin, he owned a slave. Several actually, during his time. There are slaves in Rhode Island and Connecticut, and remember, Massachusetts was the first the first colony to legalize it. So as the laws become enthripped and the laws allow for a certain labor system to become structured and intact, the need for more labor and the demand increases because we have something to rely upon. We have a source, we have laws in place, we have labor that is needed. And so what you see is that system developing. Okay. And so as a result of that, it's very important to understand what exactly are slaves producing. Not only are they producing cash crops like tobacco and rice and indigo, but they're also building roads. They're building bridges. They are highly skilled, especially in areas like in Pennsylvania, the colonies of Pennsylvania, New York, and in the areas of New England. Like these are areas where slaves are developing, skills and skills that are highly coveted, whether it's in carpentry or masonry, right? These are skills that are allowing them to be able to produce for their masters, right? They're not able to benefit from their own labor, but they're creating these skills that are highly specialized. So it's not just individuals that are in the field laboring. There is an opportunity for them to build, skills that would be able to earn them, should they be free, positions where they could earn from their labor. Okay. Now, to be very clear, you know, I don't want to think that from the images of the slave voyages or the slaves that are coming, to various areas in North and South America, that slaves are just somehow not resisting. I think resistance is one of the key terms, to associate with slavery, is that as soon as people feel that they are being prevented from living that life of freedom, they're going to resist. And so, while you see the legislation against, preventing slaves from having weapons or from being in groups or from, rebellion and the need for punishments, that is because of many of the slave rebellions that happened, between, the 1520s all the way up to the 1670s. And we will see that again in the 17th, in the 18th and 19th century as well. So it's not that rebellion, wasn't uncommon. I mean, it was not unknown for, there to be maroon societies, slaves that would run away and would meet up with Native Americans and establish communities out in, whether it is in the swamplands of North Carolina or in the maroon societies in the jungles of, present day, Colombia, right? These are areas that are, which is taking place. But what I want, for many of you to, recognize is that, where I'll leave you with is this last rebellion, is is the is that when we are seeing these colonies and when we are seeing these issues, happen, one of the things that is very precarious is that people become well aware that their conditions and exploitation are happening every day, whether those are slaves, whether they are indentured servants, whether they are the newly arrived. And Bacon's Rebellion is one example of that. This is an example where you had colonists, indentured servants, and slaves who were very, very upset with the governing style of the Virginia governor William Berkeley. And as a result, what happened was is that this individual by the name of Nathaniel Bacon basically, um, you know, is upset with the exploitation of the leadership in terms of imposing taxes, limiting people from being able to get more land, limiting opportunities for people to improve upon their society, because the people who are the elites are doing quite well, right? They don't want anything to change. They want to keep it going. But the people who are on the bottom certainly don't see it that way. And they want more rights and opportunities, not just for the elite, but for everybody. And this was also partly because, William Berkeley didn't want to have he didn't want to, incur more fights with Native Americans. Nathaniel Bacon and other people were like, no, we need to go out there and claim the land for ourselves. They really wanted to commit, mass genocide so that they could be able, to control more regions. But William Berkeley was not so sure. He's like, well, what's to stop them from slaughtering us at the same time? So there's consequences there. But what I really want you to really understand is that this was one of the first areas in North America where class, the conditions that people were under, where people were sharing those conditions, whether they're slaves, indentured servants, or, landed gentry, that elites who limit in the minds of each of those groups something that they feel that the elites are stopping them from getting can unify people together to fight back. Okay. And that's a theme that I want you to think about, not just for this moment, but for moments going on in the future, because this is one of the first things that in Bacon's Rebellion, and you can certainly, take a look at this link here in terms of the declaration that he makes in terms of what he's calling out for. So as a way to be able to, get a deeper understanding for what's actually happening. Okay. So I know that was a lot, so feel free, to write to me or send me a text message if you have any questions or concerns. Um, and I will be posting up a couple more things, for the links, but, let me know if you have any questions.